Welcome to the Empower Podcast, the show where we discuss big ideas with leaders and change makers as we work to create a Mississippi where everyone can rise. This is Grant Callen. Thank you for joining us. Public safety is foundational to strong communities. Every family wants to live in a neighborhood where they feel secure, where kids can play outside, where opportunity can take root. But achieving that kind of safety requires more than good intentions and more than simply being tough. It requires a clear understanding of what truly reduces crime and the discipline to implement policies proven to work. My guest today is a fascinating person, an economist who chose to focus her career on one of the hardest and most important questions in public policy: what actually deters crime? Dr. Jennifer Doleac serves as Executive Vice President of Criminal Justice at Arnold Ventures and is one of the nation's leading experts on evidence-based criminal justice policy. Dr. Doleac did her undergrad work at Williams College and then earned a PhD in economics at Stanford University. She lives in Houston, Texas, and she's the author of a new book called The Science of Second Chances, which came out last month. Dr. Doleac, welcome to the Empower Podcast.
Hi, Grant. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I have been looking forward to having this conversation, so I'm going to jump in. How does an economist decide to get into criminal justice reform?
Yeah. Well, definitely by happenstance. I went to graduate school to get a PhD because I loved economics. I loved the toolkit that economics provides. The idea that people respond to incentives and there are trade-offs involved in all of our decisions just felt intuitive to me. And so wanted to learn more about this toolkit and how to apply it in the real world to make policy better. But at the time, I think I really expected I would study education or discrimination or something like that. There weren't really many economists studying crime at the time. But then during the PhD, I and most of my fellow students were hunting around for what we call natural experiments, ways to apply this toolkit in the real world to distinguish correlation from causation. And I wound up reading a newspaper article about law enforcement DNA databases and how the laws vary from state to state. And the point of the article was that, the policy differences across states feel really arbitrary, that you can be convicted of the same crime in different states and have different consequences for them. But to someone like me, that's a great natural experiment. It's that apparent randomness in the system sets up a useful variation to be able to tell what the impact of databases are. And so that became my dissertation. And here I am many, many years later, still studying this topic.
Well, it's a space that certainly needs a lot of research. And so your book came out last month. I pre-ordered it, and I will be honest, I read it cover to cover in about a week. And one of the things I enjoyed most is that it is, at least my reading of it, was very unideological. You don't talk a lot about ideology. You just look at the problems with our system, and you look at what social science says about it and test what works and what doesn't. And that is incredibly refreshing in this space. So why don't you just talk about how did this book come to be and tell us about your book?
Yeah. As I said, I got into this field because I love the economics toolkit and I wanted to help make policy better. And so to me, research has always been a means to an end. It's not the end in itself. And so as a professor for many years, I spent a lot of time trying to engage with policymakers, with journalists who wanted to know, what does the evidence say? And over the years, there's been so much amazing research in this field, but I generally found that what I and my colleagues talked about in academia was really different from what you hear on cable news, right? The cable news conversation about crime and criminal justice policy feels like it's just these You've got the far left that's saying this is all a matter of poverty, and so we just need to be, investing in social services, and we can defund police and abolish prisons, and that's how we make people safer. And then people on the far right saying a lot of people are just fundamentally bad people. The only thing we can do is lock people up forever. And, to me, who's actually studying this space, those both seem like really unhelpful perspectives, frankly. And I think most people in the country also look at that conversation and they think like, those are our options. Like those are the only two options on the table. And so I really wanted to write a book that brought the really wide array of solutions that are emerging from the scientific research into the public conversation, and really try to change this conversation from one where we have people that are really are led more by ideology and kind of underlying philosophy about human nature and what their guesses are about what could change behavior, to one where we're out there trying things, recognizing that a lot of the good ideas we have won't work. But if we want to find solutions, we need to be trying and failing fast and moving on to the next potential solution, and how we find answers. And so yeah, and it turned out like, there's plenty to talk about in a book length project. So that's how I got here.
Well, it's an interesting space in that everybody wants, on both sides of the aisle, everybody wants lower crime. We all want safer communities. And yet many of the policies in this space actually don't work, and they cost a lot of money. So if you had to summarize maybe sort of what is the biggest misconception or conceptions in, about crime and punishment, what would that be?
Yeah. I think the biggest misconception in the policy space and the general conversation about crime is that the best way to deter and prevent crime is to put people in prison for longer and longer. And I think we have this general assumption that the threat of a long punishment is a really effective deterrent to criminal behavior. Like that, people will see the threat of that long punishment and they won't want to commit crime anymore. And it turns out we now know from lots of research, we've tried this now for many decades, right? And so we have lots of evidence on this. And it just turns out that that it's not an effective deterrent, right? And so there will always be a place for jail and prison. It has an important, what we call an incapacitation effect. If you take people off the streets who are an active public safety threat, that, reduces harm in the community. But there are two factors here. One is that most people age out of crime pretty quickly. So, people do a lot of dumb, impulsive, reckless stuff when they're young, and then they grow up and they do less of it. And so keeping someone in prison in their 40s, 50s, 60s is having much less of a public safety benefit than keeping them in prison when they're very soon after they commit their crime. But the other factor is that deterrent effect. It turns out most people who are committing crime aren't thinking that far ahead. And so the threat of a 10-year sentence instead of a 5-year sentence just isn't registering when someone's making a decision about whether to go out with these friends who always get them into trouble or to, hold up this liquor store. And so what really matters, what we see from lots of evidence is that what does change behavior, what does deter crime and other risky behaviors is increased in the probability of consequences rather than the severity of those consequences. And that's just frankly the opposite of how we've structured our criminal justice system in the US. In most places, you're very unlikely to get caught if you commit crime. But if you are very unlucky and you do get caught, then you face a really long punishment. So it's almost like this negative lottery.
Yeah, so this is a principle in criminal justice issues that we talk about a lot and really drives a lot of our policy reforms, but it is so misunderstood. So a lot of times, elected officials see a crime wave or even something in their community happen, and they rush to lengthen sentences because it seems sort of common sense that if we throw the book at people, that will deter people from committing these crimes. However, as you note, would-be criminals are not up to date on the latest state code about sentencing. And they're not making a decision based on, a 5-year sentence, I might do this. A 10-year sentence, it's just not worth the risk. what evidence would you point to somebody who questions that premise that severity doesn't work near as well as certainty and swiftness?
Yeah. Well, first, I just want to say we're having a lot of luck. So I now work at Arnold Ventures, which is a philanthropy that does a lot of policy work at the state level, and we're finding in general that raising this issue opens up the potential for a lot of bipartisan work that in a space where there had been real stalemates across the parties for a long time. I think both sides can get on board with solving more crime faster. It turns out like that's good for everybody. Everyone likes that idea. So I do think that it has appeal, which is really nice. It's nice when the evidence lines up with what people actually are open to doing. But so the evidence here, I think, is across a bunch of different dimensions. First, we've known for a long time that putting more police on the street reduces crime. If you have more police presence, hotspot policing, or just hiring more police officers, that reduces crime. And all of those studies have found that the effects are generally, you don't see an increase in arrests necessarily when you put more police on the streets. It's all coming through a deterrent effect. And the basic intuition here is like, if there's a police officer standing on that street corner, you're not going to steal a car right in front of him because you know you're very likely to get caught, right? You're going to go a couple blocks over where you don't see a police officer standing. And so there's that. So that evidence base, I think, provides evidence here. There's also research that I've done on DNA databases, as I mentioned before. And so this is a place where, so law enforcement DNA databases basically include just unique identifiers to be able to match individuals that are in the database to DNA from crime scene evidence. And so if you're in the database, that means you're more likely to get caught if you reoffend, because your DNA profile is searchable. So it's basically just like having a better fingerprint that is available for searching and matching. And so in studies in both the US and Denmark, which has much better data, I've been able to look at what happens to people who, just by luck of the draw, really, they either commit their crime or are charged or whatever the relevant threshold is just before or just after a database expansion goes into effect. And so if we have a new database expansion that adds everyone convicted of robbery on June 1st, anyone who's convicted of robbery just the day before does not go in the database. Anyone convicted the day June 1st or later does go in the database. But everything else about those people is the same. Everything else about the criminal justice system is the same. The only difference is that the person in the database is now more likely to get caught if they reoffend. And they know that. And so we can follow those people over time and see what happens. And in the Denmark example, that was a big expansion in the country that added anyone charged with a felony, so not necessarily waiting for a conviction. We found a 42% drop in recidivism for people added to the database. And so this is just in line with other evidence on, having surveillance cameras around or these police findings that increasing the probability of getting caught has a really big deterrent effect on future offending.
And was it assumed that the people knew they were added to the database and that was why they were less likely to commit a crime because they knew?
Right, exactly. So it's the way they're added is you basically at this point it's just a saliva swab. So you could take a saliva swab of swab their cheeks when they're at intake. So you take their fingerprints, do the cheek swab, and they'll tell them at that point this is for the DNA database.
And then the policy application of this is really not many states are actually tracking DNA data for a lot of crimes. It seems like they do for maybe violent crimes, but not everybody that comes in, right?
Yeah. So every state in the U.S. at this point includes anyone convicted of a felony. And so the policy frontier now, and they've sort of just been gradually expanding. They all started in the 1990s and they've been gradually expanding at the state level over time, just in a really as arbitrary way, as I was saying before. And at this point, so every state includes anyone convicted of a felony. So the policy frontier is, do we add people convicted of misdemeanors? Do we add people charged with a felony? And that's what that Denmark policy was. And so I think at this point, we have 19 states that include people charged or arrested for a felony offense. And there are a bunch of other states considering expanding their databases this year in this year's legislative sessions.
What would you say to those who are worried about civil rights and, maybe saying, well, okay, you haven't been convicted, but now your data is a part of this database and maybe you were not guilty?
Right. Right. So first of all, I mean, these laws all include an opportunity to have your DNA sample expunged if you're not convicted, if your case is dismissed. And there was a big Supreme Court case, I think in 2015, Maryland v. King, where the Supreme Court considered whether it was okay to add people after an arrest or charge. And they deemed it constitutional because really what this is just a better fingerprint. So if we're using the DNA profile for identification purposes, which is what we're doing, then it's just like a fingerprint. And we take everyone's fingerprints at intake and we don't expunge fingerprints if your case is dismissed. And so why would this be different? So I do realize like people do think of DNA a little bit differently. So these laws do include that expungement provision. But I think the really important thing to keep in mind, I and my colleagues find that even just talking to policymakers, there's a lot of just like basic misconceptions about what these DNA databases are. I think people hear about them and assume, okay, so the police are taking my DNA sample and they're uploading it to 23andMe and they're able to see all of my health history and like, oh, I'm at risk for all these different diseases or whatever. And that's not what's happening, right? So they're really just, they're essentially taking non-coding sections of your DNA. And it turns out that those pieces of our DNA repeat a certain number of times. They count the repeats. And that's not meaningful information for anything in terms of our health or anything else, any other sensitive information, but it does uniquely identify us. It's the number of repeats of those sections is unique to us, and so it winds up producing a string of numbers that's not unlike a social security number, where the individual numbers don't mean anything, but together they're a unique identifier for us. So it's that string of numbers that's uploaded to the database. And there are actually people from law enforcement who work in this space who put that string of numbers on their business card to hand out just as evidence that like, this is not sensitive information. The only thing the string of numbers can be used for is to match to other DNA. And so in that case, it's really, it's actually, I think of it as being much less invasive than a lot of the alternative tools we have at our disposal, like putting police on every street corner or putting cameras everywhere, much less locking people up for longer, which is, the way we're doing it right now.
Yeah. Okay, so in your book, you have a series of relatively small changes that make a big impact. And one of these you talk about is expanding DNA databases, as we've been talking about. Another one that I thought was fascinating was reducing failures to appear in court with text messages. And I thought like, if my library book is late, they text me an alert to say your library book is late. Why wouldn't we have courts doing the same kind of thing? So maybe talk about how that idea came to be and how it's working where it's been implemented.
Yeah, and I agree. I think at this point, everyone is used to having everyone text them about everything. Like, how could the courts not be doing this? So you could imagine this just being a good government service idea, right? Just like good customer service. But I think it is important to think about, if we. So in the pretrial detention bail reform space, that policy conversation is really heated and really tough to break through because of the strong ideological views on both sides about what we should be doing for people when they're awaiting trial. Should we lock them up or not? And there are some researchers and practitioners working in this space saying, sometimes we do need to lock people up when they're awaiting trial. Some people are a legitimate flight risk. Some people are a legitimate threat to the community. I think we all want those people behind bars. But when you actually talk to a lot of the people who are in that situation, you realize a lot of people aren't missing their court dates. And there are a lot of people who miss court dates. A lot of people who are missing their court dates aren't doing it because they actively were fleeing or trying to avoid consequences. They just forgot about it, or they weren't able to find childcare, or there was something else going on that they just weren't able to plan effectively to get to the court. And maybe that sounds, like a problem that, well, that's just, you've got to figure that out. If you're an adult living in society, you've got to get where you need to go. So there were some researchers who in New York City ran some experiments where they had both text message reminders, and they randomized people into different groups where you got a text message that told you, basically suggested you make a plan and ask what your plan would be. The other version was reminding you that you would get a warrant for your arrest if you didn't show up to court. So you making it really salient what the consequences are. Incentives don't work if people don't know about them. So making it salient what those incentives are. A third category, I think, got both of those messages. And then a fourth category got nothing. They were the control group. And so the text message reminders, it turns out on average, reduced failures to appear by, I think, 13%. There was another experiment they ran about the same time in parallel, where they had just the summons form that people get for really low level offenses like drinking in public. It's basically a ticket, but you do have to show up in court and deal with it. And a lot of people miss that hearing. And when you look at the summons form, it's just like a whole bunch of fine print. And then on the back of the form, it mentions, you're going to get a warrant for your arrest if you don't show up. And where and when you have to be there is like buried in the fine print at the bottom of the form. And it's like, if we actually want people to go to court for this, we should put the key information at the top in bold, right? Like highlight the information you want people to take away, knowing most people are not going to sit down and read this form really closely when they're maybe distracted, especially if they're dealing with other things in their lives. And so they just reformatted the summons form and then again had this nice experiment. They couldn't randomize in that case, but all the police officers have these forms on a pad and those pads just run out naturally at different times. And so that provided a neat natural experiment where you compare similar defendants who got different forms on the same day. And they found that also reduced missed court hearings by 13%. And so it's just, both of these are really simple, very cheap changes we could make that have real impacts on people's lives. And I think it's an example of both, we don't have to have big structural reforms to have meaningful impacts on people's lives, but also it's a reminder that we don't have to solve the entire problem in order to make a really meaningful difference. If we're reducing FTAs by 13%, that's a meaningful impact for real people and real communities and real courts. And yes, there are other people that are still missing their court hearings and we have to do something else for them. But this gives us more time and attention, since we've solved this problem for some segment of the population, gives us more time and attention to address that bigger problem.
So it's fascinating. Right after I read this part of your book, and it just prompted me to think about this, I was spending a morning in municipal court just watching what was going on. This was just a day we had set aside to go watch what was happening. And I watched this young woman come in, and the judge was really kind of fussing at her because she had missed 2 court appearances. And he was asking, like, what are you thinking missing these court appearances? And a couple of times she just said, well, I'm sorry, I've been out of town. And what was clear watching this interaction between the judge and her is she didn't realize that this was actually a very significant error she had made. And the judge was like, we are going to lock you up if you do not show up when we tell you to show up. And so I thought, in her case, if she had received a text message that said, there is likely to be a warrant for your arrest if you do not show up, I don't know what she was doing out of state, but I think she would have showed up. So
she would have gotten.
It makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, I mean, there are so many situations like this where, when I was a professor, I knew all these studies and the researchers involved, good researchers do spend a lot of time talking to people on the ground and making sure they really understand the context. So I'd kind of hear secondhand through those researchers the stories. But now I'm in this role where I'm in the policy space and have a lot more interaction with the people on the ground doing the work and the people who are in the system, and hearing these kinds of stories to just back up all of these research findings is fascinating, but also it's really useful to kind of see how it all works together and these two sides of the coin can support each other.
So another one of the topics in your book that was fascinating was, as you describe it, erring towards leniency. I think this is really interesting, especially on the backdrop of how a lot of public policy discussions around criminal justice have surrounded this concept of broken window theory, which is, you talk about it in the book and you could explain it better, but it's basically the idea that we're going to crack down hard on very small violations with the thought that that's going to actually improve outcomes for much bigger violations. So maybe talk about what the research says about erring on leniency, and why did you come to the place of seeing this as an important policy recommendation?
Yeah. Yeah, and I put this in the chapter right after the DNA databases, because I do think after people hear me say we need a higher probability of getting caught, we need to, solve more crimes faster. I think it probably is surprising that then the next thing I'm saying is err toward leniency for first-time offenders. Like, those sound like those are opposite policy calls, but they're not. So yeah, as you said, broken windows has was a really popular policy in the 1990s. It's, people in New York City especially claim that is the reason crime fell in New York. I think researchers tend to be more skeptical there because crime fell everywhere, even places that didn't implement this new type of policy. But the idea is that if you want to address more serious crime, the best way to do that is to really crack down on more minor offenses. And that tends to include both increasing the probability of consequences and the severity of the punishment. So that's where it's different from what just increasing the probability of getting caught. And so I'm on board. As I said before, there's plenty of evidence that increasing the probability of consequences matters. The question is, what are the consequences that we should be giving people when it's, say, their first time in a courtroom, or is their first misdemeanor charge, their first felony charge, their first charge at some level? Should we throw the book at them? Is that what's going to deter crime? Or should we, let them off easy and hope that they'll course correct on their own? And that's been the position of more progressive prosecutors over the last decade or so. And a lot of people worry that that's just going to embolden people. If there aren't consequences, they'll just keep, offending. And maybe the community will see that there are no consequences and they'll commit more crime too. And so I did a study with two research colleagues, Amanda Egan and Anna Harvey, in Suffolk County, Massachusetts, which is where Boston's located. And there we used a natural experiment where cases for these nonviolent misdemeanors, these really low-level charges, but there are a lot of them, so the court has to deal with them in a really fast way to keep the court moving. Those low-level cases are heard basically as if at random by different prosecutors. So whoever the arraignment prosecutor is on that day when your charge happens to be heard, that's who you get. It's very difficult to game that system to get a more lenient prosecutor. And so there's just essentially random variation in who's hearing the cases. And because the decision makers are human, that means there's variation in how lenient or how harsh the consequence is going to be. So some prosecutors are going to be more lenient, some are going to be more harsh, just because they're using their professional judgment, and their professional judgment differs. And so what we found is if you got lucky and had a more lenient prosecutor, and as a consequence had your case dismissed, you were on the order of 50% less likely to come back with new charges in the future. So it wasn't just a slight reduction in crime. It wasn't just a null effect, which I think my guess would have been, maybe it doesn't matter for these charges, right? I was the real skeptic on the research team about this policy push. And it's a 50% reduction in recidivism, which is huge. And in a context where most of our reentry programs don't work, right? Like most things we try to reduce recidivism are not effective. And so just helping people avoid that first criminal record really, really did move the needle. And then there was another study in Harris County, Texas, which is where Houston is, which is where I live now. And it was looking at what happens for first-time felony defendants. And in those cases, they weren't really looking so much at dismissing the charge, because that's less likely. But the option in those cases tends to be a deferred adjudication or a deferred prosecution. It's called different things in different places, where if you successfully make it through a probationary period, then your charges are dropped and you avoid that first criminal record. And so again, they had some policy changes, some events that led to these natural experiments where some people got lucky and got a deferred adjudication and some people didn't. And the people who got lucky and as a result, did not have that first record on their criminal record, they were again about 50% less likely to come back with new charges. And they were also able to look at employment and earnings, and those went way up for those people. So what really seems to be going on here is that a lot of people, in their first case, they've already faced a bunch of consequences, right? They've been arrested for this charge. They've probably been booked in jail. They've surely worried about what's going to happen to them and to their job and to their family. And my takeaway from this is just that's enough. That's enough of a punishment for a really large segment of this population. And then if we just get out of their way, they will course correct on their own. This was their rock bottom moment, and they can course correct. But if we put a criminal record on their record, then it actually does make it harder for them to get back on track, because then it's hard to keep a job. It's hard to find a place to live and all that other stuff. So yeah, this was a very surprising, this research really changed my mind about this policy space and this potential policy solution, but now I'm convinced.
Well, it also kind of asked the question to me of, is there something going on in our prisons that is making you more likely to commit another crime rather than less likely?
Yes. So in these particular cases, these were all nonviolent defendants. And so typically they would not be going to prison. They're most likely be on probation, but separately, absolutely. I think there's a lot of what we're doing in prison is probably counterproductive and at least not actively productive. And that feels like, as I said before, there's always going to be a place for jail and prison for just keeping people who are an active public safety threat off the streets. But if that's the only thing we're using it for, that's a really expensive intervention. And it just feels like a missed opportunity to me not to also use it as an intervention point to help put people actively on a better path when they leave, rather than just hoping they're going to grow up a little bit while they're behind bars.
Yeah, so you have a whole chapter called Prison as a Place for Change, and I want to lean in there a little bit. So to your point about prisons, if they're just taking people off the streets so that they can't commit another crime while they're in prison, they're effective at that. The problem, as I see it, is we know 95% of those behind bars will one day be out. Mm-hmm. And if they come out more likely to commit another crime than when they went in, we have failed miserably at utilizing the time while somebody's behind bars. So if the goal is some level of rehabilitation, I'd say our prisons have failed miserably. And there's this incredibly high churn of people that go to prison, come out, reoffend, and go back in. So why don't prisons work, and what can we do to make them work?
Yeah. I mean, I think the short answer is we haven't tried very hard to make them work differently than that. And there are a lot of people right now who are working very hard to find some new models, test some new models in the real world, partly driven by necessity. I mean, our current prison, the situation in U.S. prisons across the country right now is really dire. They're extremely short-staffed. And that means that they're more violent than they should be. And then that leads even more of the corrections officers to quit, because it's a miserable and dangerous place to work. And that makes the prisons even more dangerous. And so it's this vicious cycle that's clearly unsustainable. And so you have a situation where you have people on both sides, people who are representing incarcerated people who are representing corrections officers coming together saying, something's got to give here. Like, this is not a sustainable situation. We're in a real crisis situation. And so there are some really cool experiments going around in the country, testing different models, often based on more Scandinavian models, where you have more open prison unit settings. People aren't locked up in their cells for 24 or 23 hours a day. They can watch TV, they can cook, they're, hanging out with the corrections officers, having a more collegial relationship. And Arnold Ventures is funding some randomized trials of some of these. And so we're implementing them in a way that we can learn from them, and we'll see what the impact is, both on violence in the prison and on recidivism when people get out. So I think, that's the sort of thing we need to be doing if we want to try new ideas. But we also have evidence that, increasing access to cognitive behavioral therapy for people who are in prison, like strong CBT programs, those are effective at reducing recidivism. Increasing access to mental health care in general is really helpful for reducing recidivism. There are Medicaid reentry waivers that are going into effect in a lot of states right now. I'm really hopeful that will be extremely beneficial because it will increase the quality of especially mental health care that people are receiving, not only while they're behind bars, but then improve the continuity of care when they get out. And so, again, we're going to need some rigorous evaluations of those policies to see if as they're implemented, they're having the impacts that they could. But I'm hopeful that they could be having an impact. But there's also there's so many other programs in prisons that we just honestly don't know if they're effective because we haven't tested them in any kind of rigorous way. And so I'm really excited about, there are some researchers who are finding cool natural experiments, finding ways to evaluate the impacts of some of these programs. And that's a space where I'm really hopeful we'll have a lot of new research in the next 5 years that will really help inform how to spend our money.
So I'm a big fan of some of these ideas for how do we change the way we use prisons to put people on a different path.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge, as I see it, is there's just a widespread mindset. And I will confess that growing up, before I got into this space, I had this mindset. And that is that prisons should be nasty, horrible, unpleasant places because we want to create a disincentive for people to commit crimes. And if they know prison is brutal and unpleasant, they're less likely to commit crimes. And so when you talk with people about, like, okay, we've tried that approach and it's not working because people come out and they commit more crimes. They come out with all of the root issues that led to the original crimes that put them behind bars. All of those root issues are there, except for now they've been exacerbated by the prison system and they come out no better. But people hear that and they think, well, prisons should be horrible and there's no other way to do it than to make them horrible. So I guess my question is, how do we make the case that even if you just care about finances and reducing crime, that approach doesn't work?
To me, that is a perfectly reasonable hypothesis that, as you said, we've been testing. But I think this is where, we all are going to come from our various backgrounds, our various lived experiences with different ideas about what's going to be the most effective way to reduce crime. And this is one that I think, if you believe in incentives, which I do, great. If you make the consequence really harsh, and really miserable, then that should deter people from wanting to experience that consequence. And so it's a plausible idea. And the question just becomes, well, what do we see when we try it? Because lots of our good ideas don't work in practice. And so this is there aren't as many good studies as with sentence length because you just don't have as much natural variation in similar places and like how harsh the prison conditions are. But the studies that we do have show that the harshness of prison conditions has a detrimental effect, or harsher prison conditions has a detrimental effect on recidivism. So one example is there was a big reform in Colombia, the country, looking at, they realized their prison conditions are really miserable. There are all of these UN reports about them. And they built a bunch of new prisons. They were safer. They had more staff. They had more programming. They were less overcrowded. And then there was this arbitrariness, this randomness in who was sent to either the old or the new prison. And so that enabled the researcher, Santiago Tabon in this case, to look at what happened to people over time if they were lucky and got sent to the new prison versus unlucky and got sent to the older, harsh prison. And he found that recidivism was much lower for the people who went to the new prison. And that in a way, to the extent that it was the cost benefit analysis that these are more expensive prisons to run. But it was worth it basically for the lower crime rates. I do think, the bigger issue to me in this public conversation is that even beyond the different opinions about what can work and what doesn't, because those are empirical questions. We can go run some studies and let's go look at the data and you think this will work. I think this will work. Let's go try both of them and see what happens. The place where data is not helpful to resolve differences of opinion is in how much people think that, if you've done bad things, you just deserve to suffer for them. So there's this idea that there are differences in opinion about how much retribution or mercy someone deserves. And that to me as an economist, that's the sort of thing I just take as, everyone has different preferences here. And if you as a lawmaker or a citizen believe that someone deserves to just be miserable for a while after they've done something bad, even if it has no public safety benefit, that's a perfectly fine view to have. I just want us all to like put our cards on the table and know what it is we're paying for. And if that's what you want to spend tax dollars on, that's great. Like that's, who am I to say you're wrong? But if you think you're paying for public safety, that's where I just want to make clear, like you'll get a bigger bang for your buck if you do this over here instead. And so that's how I try to approach the conversation.
And that is such a great point. I think at times we think these things are at odds, and we're a very religious state. I'm a person of faith, and when I think about the dignity and inherent worth of every person, for me, that doesn't stop at the jailhouse door. There's a certain level of humanity that we owe every person because I believe they're created in the image of God. And that means we have to care for them even if they've made horrible mistakes and they deserve a consequence for that. But I think often people think, well, the best way to keep our community safe is the suffering and the horrible, and not realizing that you can actually give people consequences, but treat people with dignity and worth and work for their rehabilitation. And that's actually a better way to reduce future crime than just for prisons to be nasty and horrible. And I think you're right. I think people just don't understand it. And if there was a way for people to be clear, and again, that's what I love your book, is because you're not just talking about these in theoretical terms. You're citing research, you're doing research to show we know what works, and these are some things that actually work. But this is it really does get into the very fabric of how we think about crime and punishment, and people just bring certain different life experiences to these questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's great. I think this is especially in a context where we have some answers. We have a lot more answers than we did 10, 20 years ago, but there's still a lot of things we don't know and that we're still figuring out. And so we need different cities and towns and states to all be trying different things. And so if we need a lot of ideas on the table and a lot of crazy ideas on the table. And we need to just be trying lots of different stuff in different places. And that's how we're going to, but then do it in a way we can learn from it and that everyone can learn from it. That's how we're going to figure out what works for public safety. But I also, again, as an economist, like all of my training is you take people's preferences and their goals as given. And my job as an economist is if your goal is to reduce crime, then I can help you figure out how to optimize all of your inputs under certain constraints to achieve the lowest crime rate. If your goal is to maximize happiness or maximize employment or reduce racial disparities or whatever it is, I can help you figure out how to do that. But my job is not to tell you what your goals should be. And so that I think just personally, it's one of the things I love about our country is that we have a really diverse set of people with very different preferences and ways of looking at the world. And I think that's a really lovely thing about our society. And it doesn't need to be that. Yeah, I'm not trying to change that. I think, but I do find that it helps the conversations and that I have with policymakers and practitioners to just name the different reasons we're incarcerating people and put on the table one reason we lock people up is retribution. And we all in this room are going to have different views about how much retribution someone deserves. And that's fine. But let's just name it. That's separate from how much deterrence or incapacitation or rehabilitation are we going to get? Those are empirical questions that I can help answer with data. And presumably, even if you want a certain amount of retribution, you would also like less crime for less money. And I can help you do that.
Yeah.
So that's where I think everyone cares about the public safety piece, even if they vary in how much they care about the retribution piece.
Great point. So let's talk a little bit about reentry as we're kind of moving through sort of front end reforms, prison reforms, and now as people come out. One of the challenges I see that not only impacts criminal justice, but impacts so many other areas of life is just the number of people that have a felony conviction. So approximately 1 in 10 adult Mississippians have a felony conviction. And that has huge ramifications for their quality of life and the opportunity they have for the rest of their life. And one of the well-meaning proposals that a lot of people have proposed is ban the box.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about maybe what that proposal is and what the research says about whether it works or not.
Mm-hmm. The ban the box policies aim to help people with criminal records get their foot in the door with an employer. So, as you said, a felony conviction in particular, but all criminal records to some extent, make it more difficult for people to find work, to find housing, because employers and landlords are doing background checks. And so this means there are a lot of people who would be great employees who never get a chance to get their foot in the door and demonstrate that to an employer, because the employer sees the job application, which has a little box you check, like, do you have a criminal record? Do you have a felony conviction? If you check that box, a lot of employers just throw out your application. And so that feels really unfair, right? There are a lot of people who would be great employees who don't get a chance. And so I think the kind of natural human response to that in this context and a lot of other similar contexts is to say, okay, the employer is using information that we wish they would not use. Let's just tell them they can't ask that question anymore. And so we just ban the box, removes that box from the job application. The hope is that then employers will just interview everyone without regard for whether they have a criminal record. And then during the job interview, you have a chance to build rapport with the person, maybe hear a little bit about their history, so that by the time you actually do a background check at the end of the process, you care less about the criminal record because you've met this person as a person, right, and had a chance to relate to them. The potential problem with this is that employers care about a criminal record for some reason, right? Probably a lot of different reasons. There's some reason they're reluctant to hire someone with a record. So now if you tell them they can't ask, that's not changing anything about their underlying concerns. Now, in most cases, they're just going to try to guess who has a record up front. And they don't want to waste their time interviewing people that are probably going to have a record later that they know they're going to reject at that point. And so my concern about these policies when I first heard about them, and I'm not the only, this is like very much an economist, the way economists see the world. We hear about stuff like this and we think this could lead to what we call statistical discrimination, where when you can't see information you actually care about, you take your best guess based on the information you still do see. And in this case, because of the big racial disparities in the country and who has a criminal record, this could mean that employers are more likely to discriminate against young Black men in particular, as having a recent conviction, that it might worry employers. So at this point, there's been a bunch of research by me and others. The kind of immediate question of, does this lead to more racial discrimination? Those were the first papers, and the answer was yes. So you see that Ban the Box actually increased racial disparities in hiring and made it more difficult for young Black men without a record to get a job because employers assumed that they might have a record and so didn't even call them in for an interview. What was, I think, more surprising to a lot of us was that Ban the Box also doesn't seem to be helping people with records at all. We figured at least some of those people would be getting jobs, but they don't. So they're still like at the end of the process, the employer does the background check and they still don't hire you. And so there's something about the record that employers are worried about. And maybe it's the concern about a lawsuit, a negligent hiring lawsuit, something like that. Maybe they just view a record as being, a credential, a negative signal about, you've spent time with some bad people and doing bad things, and maybe you're less honest, or maybe you have some untreated mental illness or substance use issues that, and I need someone who's going to show up on time every day and do a good job. So how can I tell? I don't have a good way to tell if you are different from everyone else who has a record, and so I'm just going to lump you all together. Anyway, so the punchline there is that Ban the Box has not been effective and actually seems to be making life much worse for a bunch of people who don't have a record, who already struggle in the labor market for various reasons. And so my view is that we should be spending our time trying other things.
One of the ideas you propose, which was fascinating, was rehabilitation certificates.
Mm-hmm.
You want to share what that would be like?
Yeah. So there are a bunch of courts around the country that offer rehabilitation certificates. They're called different things in different states. But basically, the idea is that if you have a criminal record, you can go to a judge and basically argue that you have, you've been rehabilitated. You participated in these programs. You can have character witnesses. You can have, drug tests, whatever it is you want to show to argue to the judge. And if they're convinced, they can give you the certificate. And so there have been a couple of neat studies now where the researchers apply to jobs on behalf of fictitious applicants so that they can randomize, do you have a criminal record? Do you have one of these certificates? And then see what happens. And basically what they find is, as elsewhere, if you have a felony conviction, you are less likely to get called back by the employer than if you don't have a felony conviction. But what's really interesting is that if you have a felony conviction and a rehabilitation certificate, you're called back at almost equal rates to people who had no conviction at all. So these did what Ban the Box aimed to do, which was like get people's foot in the door so that they could argue or try to make the case to the employer. And in this case, they weren't hiding anything up front. So there's nothing that's going to be revealed later in a background check, right? The employer knows when they're calling you back, you've got a criminal record, but they also have this signal from a judge that this wise person who knows you, at least and has heard, your case, thinks that now you would make a good employee. So I'm willing to take a chance on you as an employer. Different states have different rules about who's eligible for these. And this is a place where I would love to see more research on what the real world impact is. But that's the kind of intervention that feels much more promising to me.
That's great. So we have a number of lawmakers that listen to the podcast who have come on the podcast. It's interesting to me in the back of your book, you have 6 challenges that keep people from implementing and adopting these science-backed approaches. And I think these are pretty relevant. I mean, they're relevant to a lot of people that work in the criminal justice space, but I think especially lawmakers who are grappling with how to adopt policies that actually work and actually accomplish the outcomes we want. So could you maybe share some of those? What are those challenges that keep us from adopting good policies?
Yeah. I think a lot of it is not really knowing, the kind of research that's possible in these spaces. I think a lot of people think, well, if you can't do a randomized trial, then the best you can do is sort of, just compare people who completed the program with people who didn't. And part of what I hope to showcase in the book is there's a whole toolkit out here. There holds a whole group of social scientists who can use these natural experiments to help get traction on some of these challenging questions and help you understand if your program is effective or your policy is effective without having to actually run a randomized trial. And so part of it, I think, is just to make this scientific process feel more feasible. Another reason is that I think people don't apply this more scientific perspective is they generally just assume that their good ideas are going to work. Right? We just assume most things are going to work. If we have here's a problem, here's a policy that seems perfectly, intuitive. Sure, pass that policy and we can all go home. And I think, where economists are used to being the skeptics in the room who assume that you pass this policy, now everyone's going to re-optimize and change their behavior to try to get back to what they were doing before. And so we assume most things aren't going to work and that changing behavior is really hard. And so my strong view at this point is that we should all be aiming to fail fast rather than pretend we're not going to fail. It's this general approach that there's an obvious solution and we just need to implement it, and then we can all just congratulate ourselves on solving the problem. That is what is slowing us down. If we acknowledge up front, this is the fact that this problem still exists, the fact that we still have high recidivism rates after many, many decades of all of us wanting to reduce them, that means this problem is really complicated, right? And our obvious solutions are probably not going to work. And so we should be aiming to just start trying stuff and assume most of our first ideas are not going to work. And so our goal should be to fail fast, figure it out as fast as possible so that we can move on to the next idea. And, and then there's a whole army of researchers out there that would love to work with policymakers to help them figure out how to try things in a way that we can learn from them. We spend a lot of time at Arnold Ventures working with policymakers to try to embed, these experiments, these either natural experiments or sometimes actually randomized trials into legislation so that they can legislate something as a pilot or in a way that we can ensure we're going to learn from it along the way. So if anyone listening, I know we've been talking with lawmakers in Mississippi about doing some of this. If others are interested, we would love to chat. But yeah, I think just aiming for this fail fast mentality is the big switch I'm hoping most people will make. I think this view that these problems are so big that only big structural reforms can possibly make a dent in any of these issues. Like we actually are going to have to solve poverty or, fundamentally there's some overarching problem with humanity or something that we have to fix in order to make a meaningful difference. And a lot of what I'm trying to showcase in the book are totally feasible policy changes that I think a lot of advocates would view as way too small to possibly matter. Some of them reduce recidivism by 10%, some by 20%, some by 50%. But even the 10% ones, those add up, right? And if we can reduce the funnel of people coming in through the criminal justice system by 10% at each step, that's a meaningful reduction in the number of people cycling through the system each year. And so one of the main takeaways I hope people come away from the book with is just, not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. We don't have to solve the entire problem in order to be making a difference. And I do sometimes think that these calls for big structural reform are actually, they slow us down. They wind up being, perhaps unintentionally, but they wind up being excuses not to do anything when there are a lot of really promising and in many, I would even say proven solutions at our fingertips that could make a big difference for a lot of people's lives that are on the table, and we are not using them. We're not running with them. And so I really hope that people, are maybe more willing to take these smaller steps that I really do think will make a big difference.
When you think about a state like Mississippi, is there a policy or a couple of policies that are, as you're talking about, these small differences that will make a big impact that you think lawmakers should implement?
I think, as in other states, we're excited about shifts that can try to help law enforcement solve more crimes faster. So whether it's expanding the DNA database, whether it's we're supporting something called the Victim Act in a bunch of different states. So that basically would give law enforcement more resources for hiring detectives or buying rapid DNA machines or piloting drones as first responders or other kinds of interventions that could help them solve crimes faster. So really trying to shift the emphasis away from severity of sentence or length of sentence to, increase the certainty of swiftness and certainty of punishment. So that's one big bucket. Another area that I know we're talking with a bunch of states with, including I think Mississippi, is thinking about how to increase access to mental health care in jails and prisons. And this is one where there was a really nice randomized trial of accreditation for jail health facilities that found that randomizing these jail facilities to be accredited or not, or to at least have access to accreditation or not, had pretty dramatic effects on mortality for inmates and some suggestive evidence on recidivism, improvements in recidivism. And so that's something we would really love to replicate in other places. And so that's the kind of policy we would love to work with states including Mississippi to roll this out as a pilot, to see if that replicates in their home state. And if it does, it's a pretty cheap intervention all in, but it trains the health staff and the correctional staff to work together to make sure that they can maintain safety in the facility while also getting inmates the care they need. And that has really big benefits for everyone involved. So, yeah, those are a couple ideas, but I've got a lot more. If anyone listening wants to chat, I'm here.
And the book is full of ideas. So lawmakers or policy staff that are interested, pick up the book. In fact, If you're a lawmaker and you want a copy of the book, text me or email me. I will send you a copy of the book. Y'all, you will love it. You will benefit from it. The book is called The Science of Second Chances, A Revolution in Criminal Justice. It's fantastic. Final question. If we get this right and we follow the evidence and we implement great policies in criminal justice that actually work, what does the system look like? What are the outcomes that change over the next 20, 30 years?
I genuinely think that switching our focus to increasing the swiftness and certainty of punishment, so solving more crimes faster, I genuinely think that's our ticket out of a mass incarceration. We'll have a much smaller criminal justice system, at the same time having a lot more justice for victims, and more accountability for people who do break the law. And so I think we can have both. But I think overall if we get this right, if we really put our minds to following the evidence here, we do a lot of stuff that costs a lot of money and does not work, or at the very least does not work as well as it could work. And so if we really started to, rigorously test what we're doing, switch to this fail fast mentality, dedicate ourselves to, channeling money toward the stuff where there is strong evidence backing it, we can have a much smaller criminal justice system, fewer people in prison because there will be less crime. We will have dramatically lower crime rates, and we will have a lot more taxpayer dollars left over to spend on other things or, send back to them. And so this is a place where we can have a lot more public safety for a lot less money if we are just smarter about this.
Well said. That's a great place to close it. Thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for your book. And thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Grant. This was great, and I really appreciate all your kind words about the book. Glad you enjoyed it.
Thanks so much for listening to today's episode of the Empower Podcast. To learn more about how you can get involved and we can work together to make Mississippi a place where everyone can rise, go to our website at empowerms.org. Please like or subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you'll be notified of future episodes.